Hi, Dr. Peta Stapleton here. I'm a registered clinical and health psychologist here in Australia, and I'm also an associate professor in psychology at Bond University. Part of what I do in my research career is I actually am known for the research clinical trials that we run in the area of EFT, emotional freedom techniques, commonly called tapping, because it describes the technique itself, where we stimulate pressure points on the body with a tapping technique, a somatic stimulation. But that is also coupled with a cognitive statement where we actually are quite mindful and present to what our problem is, and we do acknowledge that while we're actually tapping. Now, while this research spotlight series has other videos talking about the research and the outcomes in different areas, we have now over 120 publications that have been conducted in academic settings, and certainly you can access those in the links below. What I want to talk about today is a question that has recently been raised, which is, I guess there's more and more acceptance now of EFT or tapping, not just in the academic field, but certainly in the clinical and health areas out there in the world. And people now, I guess, are much more open to the idea that tapping on pressure points whilst keeping the mind focused on distress or what's going on does indeed result in these physiological changes. They include things like DNA regulation changes, immune system changes, blood pressure certainly, as well as emotional issues such as people reporting levels of stress and anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, things like that. We know there's profound changes in things like the stress hormone cortisol in the body after tapping. But the question that gets raised now is very much, why don't I have to keep tapping? So if an issue presents itself, say a phobia, let's talk about that just as an example. Someone has a phobia. Maybe it's a fear of spiders, for example. So that's quite a common one. If someone's got a fear of spiders and they do some tapping on that, they tap on obviously anything to do with the phobia, when they might remember it starting, how they feel when they see a spider or they think about a spider, where they may have learnt that. Perhaps there was a parent that modelled that behaviour too, so they may have memories when they were younger. So let's just assume they do a whole lot of tapping around the spider phobia. And all of that feels better at the end of it, so however long that takes. The question then is, so how come next time they encounter a spider, they don't have the same reaction? How come they don't have to tap again to calm themselves down with the thought or the vision or the sight of a spider? So what happens to the brain? And that's what I want to answer in this research spotlight today. So the brain does have an ability to update learnings. And there is a theory that is emerging around this that obviously I have written about in my book that is being produced by Hay House. That book is called The Science Behind Tapping and will be available as of March 2019. And this brain's way of updating old learnings with new ones very much sits in what we call the memory reconsolidation theory. Now, this is not work that has come out of the EFT field, but I have put some links below if you do want to read further into Bruce Ecker's work around memory reconsolidation theory. But the suggestion is that there are three things that the brain needs to update an old learning with a new one. And then once that new learning has been updated, that then becomes the primary learning, so the main one that the brain uses, which is why then perhaps see a spider, have already done the tapping, don't get the same reaction. So what are these three things? Because I can hear you asking, and obviously this is where we then use EFT as the explanation, so I'll walk through it. So three things. The first step is you do actually need to access the level of distress that might be going on about something. So that does need to be present. EFT does that by obviously having someone state the setup statement and they tap on the side of the hand point while they might actually work through that. So we do actually have to bring up the distress, the level of problem, whatever it might be. So we need to access that. At the same time, so that's step one. Step two is at the same time a person experiences that level of distress. And I do really like Dr. Larry Burke's comment that he says we only bring it up long enough to hit the delete button. It's like the software that is in the program there, or maybe the virus that's running loose. We're not bringing it up to re-traumatize somebody, no matter what the distress is. Let's think of that phobia example. We're just bringing it up long enough to do the tapping, which then is the delete button if we're talking about a computer analogy. So second step is we bring it up long enough, but at the same time, we must do an opposite emotion or activity. Now, an opposite emotion to distress would have to be one that is obviously of calm. And we're not saying at any level that EFT is the only thing that does this. There would be many other types of modalities, perhaps in the energy psychology field or even in mainstream therapies. But this is how they're working to update an old learning, and it is indeed how EFT works to do the same. So the second step is when I bring up the distress from step one, at the same time in step two, I must do an opposite reaction. And for us in tapping, it is the somatic tapping that we now know results in profound physiological changes, but certainly emotional ones as well. So when someone's engaged in the acupoint tapping, that is the opposite reaction in step two. That could be something else for another therapist or another modality, but for us, it's the tapping. Now, step three in the memory reconsolidation theory is repeat this several times. So we need to repeat it often enough that the brain gets a new experience at the same time that they might think of a memory of a phobia or they encounter a spider, they do an opposite reaction so that that is then paired with a calm feeling. So you might be a therapist, you might know of other modalities that might do this through an exposure process where they do different types of relaxation. So for us in tapping, EFT, that third step is the repeated rounds of tapping. That's when we're checking and we're saying, how much is that distress level now when I think about the spider? Where is it now after another couple of rounds of tapping? So 3 steps. Let's go through them one more time. 1, you must access the distress. You must feel it. 2, at the same time you feel it, you must do an opposing reaction or feeling state. That's that juxtaposition that in tapping is the acupoint tapping, as we're saying what the problem is. And 3, we must repeat that several times to give the brain and the body a new experience of what's attached to the memory, the situation, the feeling state, whatever it might be that we're actually tapping on. So I really hope this has kind of given a little bit more kind of information perhaps wrapped around this whole idea of why don't we have to keep tapping? Why is it that in my research field of food cravings in particular, someone can tap on a food craving and have no feeling or desire level for that food whatsoever, but a year later, when we check in with them, still report, or even have forgotten about the food, but report still a lack of desire, and they haven't had to do any tapping since the trial a year earlier. So this explains a little bit now about how the brain actually can update its new learnings. The whole field of neuroplasticity has shown that in the last decade. The brain absolutely has an ability, and tapping is one way to do that. So I hope you've enjoyed this. Feel free to share this with anyone that you think might be interested. I'm Dr. Peta Stapleton, and it's been really great sharing this with you today.